Peter, great to talk to you about this book you have been toiling over for several months.
Well, it's a pleasure, and yes, I've been writing it for several months, but also I've been working on it for probably 30 years, maybe longer, since I first went to China and had the marvellous eye-opening experience. But now to have to realise that China under Xi Jinping is a completely different country and not safe certainly for Australian journalists, but for many Australians will have to think twice about their next trip to China if the borders are opened.
Well, let's start with the man who has been driven to reposition China as such a dominant power, prepared to wield that power indiscriminately. In your book, you go back to his roots. What did you learn about Xi Jinping?
Well, Xi Jinping, his youth, his teen years, don't give you any clue really about the leader that he's to become, because his father was one of Mao Zedong's comrades in arms. He was a commander in the Long March, the battle, the guerrilla war that the Chinese Communist Party had to fight to win the revolution and take control. And so that made his father one of the great heroes of modern China, until the day that he wasn't, until the day when Mao turned against him during the Cultural Revolution, that tremendous upheaval that killed something between 1 and 1.5 million people. And in that process, Xi Jinping, today's president, then aged 9, was turned out of what was elite accommodation in the old imperial gardens, Zhongnanhai now, the leadership compound, and his family was persecuted horribly. His father was paraded around on the back of a truck with a timber signboard declaring him a class traitor. Xi Jinping himself, as a kid, was paraded on stage in front of mass rallies who would scream his name and denounce him. He was wearing a dunce's cap. His own mother would have to stand in the front row and denounce her son. He was beaten up. He was locked up several times. The whole family had a horrible time. His sister was killed in the turmoil. His mother was tortured. It was just a horrible situation. His father was sent into the countryside to work in a tractor factory, but Xi Jinping himself was sent to live in a cave in a dirt-poor, frozen part of China, where he had a very miserable time, and he has observed years later that those moments, those days, those years of terrible suffering set his life's path. Now, you know, if you suffer that amount of pain and discomfort and mental anguish under a political regime, you would think it would produce in you some resistance. But instead, Xi Jinping came to the opposite conclusion. Instead of deciding to reject the party, decided that he desperately wanted to join. He applied 10 times to join. Eventually, they accepted him. And then, of course, to master the party, lead the party, and then make it as oppressive and repressive and more Mao-like than it has been at any time since Mao.
Which sort of makes you puzzled as to how he reached this point, and in a way not surprising that potentially Australia underestimated his true agenda as he rose through the ranks.
Yes, and Australia did, but everybody did, and it could be forgiven for doing so because he kept his plans and intentions under tight wraps. Nobody really knew his intentions until the day he became General Secretary of the party. The two Western leaders with whom he spent most time as Vice President before ascending to the presidency were Joe Biden, then US Vice President, now President of course, and Kevin Rudd, then Australian Prime Minister. Xi Jinping visited Australia, visited Canberra, spent several days in the lodge in intensive talks with Kevin Rudd, spent a lot of time travelling across the US with Joe Biden. They spent a lot of time together. And both Joe Biden and Kevin Rudd came out of that experience declaring Xi Jinping to be a man that they could do business with. They have been proved completely wrong. Joe Biden has since denounced Xi Jinping as a dictator and a thug, he's what he called him, and a grave threat to America's future. And Kevin Rudd has declared the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping to be the enemy of liberal democracy.
Which brings us to the relationship that seemingly, for now at least, has fractured beyond repair between Australia and China. You write that Prime Minister Scott Morrison says Beijing's trade sanctions are like the traditional Chinese lion downs, mostly theatrical, that at the end of the day the relationship is still going on. Is that true in what you've looked at?
Well, it's true that they're the words from Scott Morrison in the interview that he gave me for the book. Is the underlying assertion true? Well, in one sense, Absolutely, it's true. So even though the Chinese government concocted punitive tariffs on well over $20 billion worth of Australian exports to China, and we know the story, right? The barley, the beef, the thermal coal, the copper, the timber, the seafood, and so on. Despite all of that, because of the raging price of these expensive rocks that we happen to have a lot of in Australia called iron ore, that's swamped the effect of the trade sanctions and meant that overall Australia's total merchandise exports to China last year were down only 2%, and they were down from a record high. So Australia's trade with China overall at the macro level is still prospering, even though individual companies will be suffering, and some of them, especially in the wine industry, which can't readily redirect their exports, unlike the thermal coal sector or the barley industry. Some of those companies will suffer and are suffering horribly. But the macro picture is still a pretty good one. And Australia and China, although there's a freeze on political level contacts, at the diplomatic level, regular officials levels, they still talk to each other, and there's still a lot going on. So in that sense, Morrison is quite right in saying that there's a lot of atmospherics. That's one of his quotes. There's a lot of atmospherics, but at the end of the day, the relationship is still going on and still has value for Australia.
Does that, though, again underestimate how far Xi will go, and perhaps that this is only the case as long as China can't get what they need, and particularly our iron ore? They can't get it now, but they could down the track get it elsewhere.
Well, on the iron ore question, it's sheer luck, right? So the world's two big suppliers of iron ore are Brazil and Australia. Massively dominate the market. Brazil has been out of action because, first of all, because of mudslides and production problems, and then COVID. Now, one day, the Brazilian supplier, Vale, will come back online and the Australian price premium will evaporate. But beyond that, and that could happen any time in the next year, but beyond that, the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party is determined to break this duopoly, and Chinese state-owned entities are spending well over $10 billion invested in a very prospective, very rich new iron ore field in Guinea in West Africa, which it's some years away, minimum 5 years, maybe 10, before the Simandou iron ore prospect in Guinea can be brought online. But if and when it does, that's another Australia equivalent entering the market. So we are very lucky, it turns out, to have this shortage of iron ore that China needs at the moment. It's not going to last forever. And Australia needs to prepare for that eventuality for the day when we can't fall back on selling rocks.
So how do we prepare? How do we manage this relationship while protecting our economic security and our own sovereignty? Well,
the broad strategy that the federal government's got, in my view, is right, and that is defend and block where Australia must to protect its sovereign interests against the Chinese ambitions. But on the other hand, where there is scope to cooperate and there are common interests, and this is a region that we are going to share with China, and China is going to be a large and important player for many, many years, then we can, should, and indeed must cooperate, whether it's dealing with transnational crime or climate change or trade or whatever. So Australia stands ready to do both, is doing both, wants to improve the relationship with China. But the Chinese government has clearly laid down its terms, the 14 demands that it's lodged against Australia. None of those are to do with trade. Not one of those 14 is a trade question or a trade matter. All 14 relate to Australian sovereignty in one way or another, and they're questions on which Australia cannot budge. So the question is, does the Chinese Communist Party at some point decide that it has tested Australia's sovereign will enough and can therefore start to slowly resume or return to some form of normal diplomatic contact? Or does it decide that it's simply going to make an example of Australia and will not let Australia get away with standing up for itself?
Peter, the book is Red Zone, China's Challenge and Australia's Future, a very important topic. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure, Bev.